Thanks for your time today, everybody. My name is Brian Regli, and my goal is to maximize the value of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for the governor. I've had the privilege of working with him in various capacities over the last 20 to 25 years, and as a leader, he brings to the table, I think, a tremendous capacity to understand the complexity of the challenges that we face in the infrastructure space. So I want to begin by telling you a bit of a story about how I explained the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits to him when we first started discussing it a year ago. And I want to talk about how it applies to housing authorities and to not-for-profits and to governmental agencies, because I think that's an important place to start our conversation. And folks like Keith and others will carry it forward. But the story I'd like to tell them is this, is like, look, if you had the legislature appropriate $10 billion to build a nuclear power plant, a Commonwealth of Pennsylvania owned and operated nuclear power plant. I'm not suggesting we should, but let's say we did. And we put it in Indiana County in Pennsylvania. Here's what would happen. As part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania would receive back from the U.S. Department of Treasury, assuming we use prevailing wage, which certainly we would, $3 billion from that $10 billion investment. That's the investment tax credit component of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the base of this Section 48 energy property. If we were to use domestically manufactured materials, and certainly there are companies like Mitsubishi and others who are here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania who are building these kinds of turbines and all these components, you would get another 10%. You would get a $4 billion check back from the U.S. Department of Treasury. Because that is an energy community defined in the Inflation Reduction Act and further articulated by the U.S. Department of Energy as communities that have been affected by coal and the transition of coal and energy and employment in those spaces, you would get another $1 billion back from the U.S. Department of Treasury. And interestingly enough, although this is a capped tax credits, the others are uncapped, the capped tax credit. If you were to build an affordable housing project adjacent to the nuclear power plant, I mean, maybe people don't want to live there, but just use that as an example for a second. Theoretically, an additional 20% of the value of that could apply for the tax credit, $7 billion back from the U.S. Department of Treasury for building a $10 billion nuclear power plant. Now, I do not suggest that all the housing authorities on the call build nuclear power plants. It's probably not something that you really want to necessarily do with your, local housing investment dollars, but it applies to solar arrays. It applies to geothermal heat pumps. It applies to all kinds of technologies that could be integrated into the development concepts that every single housing authority has in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Either because you're doing, a 4% and you're renovating, even if you're doing a 9%, the investors can qualify. But you might say to me, Brian, what is this thing that you're telling me that the Pennsylvania government receives tax credit? We don't pay taxes. No, you don't pay taxes. We don't pay taxes as a state. You don't pay taxes as, a housing authority. Yet, because of the direct pay provisions in the U.S., Treasury regulations that have recently come out, all of that embodied in the Inflation Reduction Act allows you and your leadership to qualify for those tax credits, assuming that you are the ones who made the investment. So concretely, if there is a community house that sits in the center of a development and the housing authority has an easement to it or owns that building, even though the tax credit entity controls the rest of it, if it's your solar array and it's offsetting the cost of your operation in your particular building as part of that development, then the housing authority gets the tax credit. It's 30, 40, 50% of the value of it. It's a check delivered directly back to you. And ultimately, anytime you start thinking about new development or renovating existing development, the extent to which you can braid together these tax credits from the perspective of your sources and uses, there's a lot of things that might not have penciled out that suddenly look very, very different. And from the perspective of underwriting, when you're trying to demonstrate the accretive cash value of each of these individual investments, surely if you lower the utility bills of the individuals that are living in these sites because you built a solar array proximate to that, and now all of a sudden there's an offset, because the solar array is basically paying for a portion of the community's energy consumption. And depending on how you're managing your utility allocations within the context of the investments that you're making, you can imagine all sorts of ways in which these tax credits could change and shape how your development moves forward. We at the budget office at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania are standing up a team of people to assist and help you understand the value of these tax credits. We're already talking to many of the housing authorities in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania about how these rules apply to their particular investment strategies. And the good news is this: these tax credits are available under statute through 2032. So it's not like you have to do something tomorrow, but you do have to start planning today and tomorrow, because you guys know anytime you try to do a renovation, put things on the table, try to create new investments, new values, it's going to take time. So if you're not looking at your capital investment plan over the next 3, 4, 5 years relative to these kinds of energy investments, you lose a huge opportunity to maximize the value of the Inflation Reduction Act. Ultimately, that's the job the governor gave me. So that's why I'm here talking to you today, to give you a little bit of context, right? And why am I starting with tax credits? And many of you, of course, deal with the types of tax credits that are involved in affordable housing. And you understand something having to do with tax credits. And that's probably a good thing to sort of start as a context. Even though, again, I would emphasize these are different types of tax credits. These are direct payments. This is a different incentive regime than what you've usually dealt with. The reality is this. When the Congressional Budget Office scored the Inflation Reduction Act and its cost to America's taxpayers, 1/3 of it is appropriations, but 2/3 of it are tax cuts. And those tax cuts, these tax investments, are transformative at the scale of literally trillions of dollars when taken in aggregate. The initial investment of the CBO and then increased over time is that $600 billion of tax credits should be issued nationwide as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. If you reverse engineer it, that means that $4 to $5 trillion with a T of investments in new critical infrastructure, energy infrastructure would be happening in order to obtain those tax credits. Now, they may be a $10,000 solar array on a community center. They may be $1 million solar array or a geothermal system that provides district heat for a housing community, or it may be a utility-grade solar project down the street, or it may be a nuclear power plant in the middle of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. You can imagine this huge structure that's associated with all of these various investments. So folks like Keith will talk about, and correctly so, the opportunity to take some of the direct appropriations, because those are important as well, and how we work with PHFA and how we work with each of you individually to unlock the capabilities of those programs and the weatherization programs and all of the additional programs that are coming through the utilities so that we can reach into the low-income communities and improve housing stock. All of that is really important because all of it adds to basis. And for those of you who deal with tax every day, and I'm sure some of you on this call do, everything that adds to basis improves the financeability of the thing, but it also creates more value from the perspective of the tax credits. So for me, it all comes back to the same thing. If you're looking at your sources and uses and you built your spreadsheet in 2018 and there's kind of a way in which you do things, it's time to update that model. The things that I've told you about, we're happy to help you with. The things that you're going to hear about during the course of the day will further amplify those capabilities. But I invite all of you to think through what these opportunities may look like, to communicate with us about how we can work together on these issues. And that's really the thing I wanted to start with and the thing I wanted to say.